Dr Emily Grossman. I'm a science communicator, science broadcaster, writer and educator. And more recently, I'm one of the co-founders of a group called Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. So before I tell you a little bit about the science behind the climate and ecological crisis, I'd like to tell you about how I got involved with Extinction Rebellion, and specifically Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. So I've spent my career, my life, telling the truth and trying to find out the truth about life, about the world, and helping others to understand the truth of what's going on in the world. And I've done that as a climate science communicator, as a science communicator. So my role has always been as a science communicator. I'm a former scientist. I have a PhD. Oh, it's very loud. I have a PhD in molecular biology. I've worked as a science researcher. I've worked as a science teacher. But now my role in science communication is to explore areas of science, to dig deeply into specific areas of science that are particularly relevant or exciting or interesting that I think people in the public, kids, other academics really need to hear about. And I've been doing that as my career for quite a long time. So it was with that background, with that experience, I went along to the Extinction Rebellion protests in April. And I went along, I have to say, knowing not much about climate science, not much further than I had covered in my degree in natural sciences, and with a basic understanding of climate science as most scientists know. So I came along to the rebellion mostly to support my partner, who was one of the key leaders of the Samba band. And I came along kind of thinking, well, you know, what's all this about? Now, obviously I knew that climate science was a thing. Obviously I knew that there was a problem. And I know that scientists across the scientific community have been raising the alarm about climate change for over 40 years. But quite honestly, I thought, well, it can't be as bad as all that. It can't be as bad as all that, because otherwise, people like me, who are relatively well-read, well-versed, well-aware in the scientific world, would know a lot more about it. It can't be as bad as all that, because otherwise it would be on the front page of every newspaper. It would be being spoken about on every radio and TV show, documentaries. We'd be being told. And I thought, well, it can't be as bad as all that, because otherwise, surely, the governments would be doing something. Like, these claims that were being made on the streets back in April, I was like, okay, well, I really admire these passionate people, these activists, but it can't be as bad as all that. So that's what I went to day 1, day 2, day 3 of the rebellion in April feeling, thinking, could it really be that bad? So, you know, I did a little bit of reading, obviously all the stuff that was going on in the papers at the time, and I thought, God, this sounds pretty bad. So, from then, I decided, as is my way, you know, I have this very inquiring mind, this analytical mind. I want to make sense of the world, I want to understand the world, and I will not accept anything unless people tell me why, unless they give me an explanation, and unless I find out the truth for myself. That is what I've been trained to do. That's what I have a degree in, a PhD in, and an entire career, 3 different careers, in analysing information and finding out the truth. So I was like, right, okay, let me have a little look at this. So that was, about 8 months ago. And since that day, I've been on probably one of the steepest learning curves that I've ever been on. And I'm still on it. And I can honestly say, since that day, I have not had a single good night's sleep. So I have made it my personal mission from that moment to find out everything I could about climate science, about biodiversity loss, about ecology, about what's going on in the world, and about what the government here and across the world are and aren't doing. I've read hundreds, if not thousands, of newspaper articles, gone back to the primary sources, because that's what we're trained to do as researchers and academics. I've spoken to countless climate scientists, top heads of researchers, head researchers, heads of institutes across the globe. And I also joined with the scientists who were already aligned with the Extinction Rebellion community and started talking to them in group chats, but also one-to-one, saying, teach me, show me what's going on, point me towards the articles, point me towards the resources, point me towards the peer-reviewed science, because that, of course, is where we need to start, and of course, actually, is where we need to end. So that's what I've been doing. And like I said, it's been pretty dark. It's been probably one of the darkest, 8 months now of my life. And I've had some pretty challenging times in my life. Because the more I read, the more I found out, the more I understood, the deeper I got, the more I realized that it really is that bad. And it's not just that bad, it's actually a lot worse. It's actually a lot worse than most of us with our human capacity, our human minds can actually comprehend. Which is why a lot of us, even beginning to start to comprehend the enormity of what's going on the planet, enter some kind of trauma response. We enter some kind of either panic, kind of, oh my God, it's all terrible, and then we just sort of burn out and don't know what to do. Or we stick our head in the sand. We get on a plane and go on holiday. We just think, we can't handle this. Or we go into denial. No, this can't be true. That's kind of where I had been up till this point. Because most of us suffer from something called cognitive dissonance, where even when we do get our heads around the enormity of what's going on, we then continue to just live our everyday lives because it's just too big, it's just too much for us to think, well, how can we actually live? How can we actually keep going, knowing what we know, knowing the truth? So I'd like to share with you a little bit of that truth, a little bit, just scratch the surface, touch the surface of what is now known, what is unequivocal about the truth about the climate and ecological emergency, and why really, if we do know the truth, as I know a lot of people here today do, there is nothing that we can do except to get out into the streets and take action, or to do whatever action works for you. But the way I come to see it now is that if anything in my life is not to do with raising awareness about the climate and ecological crisis, if it's not to do with trying to find solutions, trying to get the government to take action, trying to raise awareness, coming on talks like this, honouring those like the amazing human beings we see here today who've tried to tell the truth, who've tried to uncover the truth. If we're not doing that, if I'm not doing that, I don't really feel there's much point me doing anything else. Now, I'm not suggesting everyone needs to do that, everyone's got their different path, but for me, as someone who understands science, as someone who can analyse information, who can tell the difference between studies that hold weight, that are peer-reviewed, that should be listened to, and between ones that are funded by fossil fuel companies, or are written by people who have an agenda to not really expose the truth. As someone who has the training and the background to be able to do that, that's now the most important thing to me. And for that reason, myself and another amazing Extinction Rebellion rebel, a guy called Leo, founded at the end of August a community from the science community that was already within Extinction Rebellion. We founded a community called Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. And that community are a community of scientists which are now growing in numbers across the globe, who are wanting not just to tell the truth about the climate and ecological emergency, but are wanting to take action. And as part of that community, which has now grown from 2 to 5 to several hundred scientists, we have created a scientist declaration in support of non-violent direct action against government inaction against the climate and ecological emergency. And our declaration, which sets out the truth about the emergency, describes how radical the action that is needed to be taken must be, and also how serious the situation we are in is. That declaration also explains why we now need, like you, brave rebels who are listening today, to take to the streets for civil disobedience, for protests, for vigils like today, to make change happen. We've tried everything else. Scientists have been warning about this, like I said, for 40 years. I mistakenly, probably like a lot of people, thought, well, it can't have been that bad because nobody listened. But the fact is, scientists have been told throughout our careers, throughout the history of science, that our responsibility, our job as scientists, is to simply tell the truth and explain the facts and the evidence. We are told that if we do that, governments and the media will listen, they will report on the truth, and they will take action proportionate to that truth. But the fact is, that hasn't happened, and we've been let down. We've been let down time and time again. So scientists are now feeling that the only thing they have left to do is to act not just from a scientific obligation, but to act from a moral duty to actually come out onto the streets to make sure the truth is heard. So I'd like to read you just a small excerpt of our scientist declaration and then tell you just a little about the science of the crisis and why it is that we and you really truly should believe the truth that this is an emergency, that we are in a crisis, that we have to act now and we have to act radically, that the future of our children, our grandchildren is at stake, and that this will impact every single one of us, whether directly or indirectly, whether it's in the next few years, in the next 5, 10 years, or by the end of the century. Radical action must be taken. Scientist Declaration of Rebellion. As scientists, we have dedicated our lives to the study and understanding of our world and our place in it. We declare that scientific evidence shows, beyond all reasonable doubt, that human-caused changes to our Earth, changes to our land, our seas, and our air are severely threatening the habitability of our planet. We further declare that overwhelming evidence shows that if global greenhouse gas emissions are not brought rapidly down to net zero, if biodiversity loss is not halted, we risk damage to our planetary life support systems that is catastrophic and irreversible, causing incalculable human suffering and many deaths. We note that despite the scientific community first sounding the alarm on human-caused global warming more than 4 decades ago, no action taken by governments so far has been sufficient. Global greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise steeply. Biodiversity loss continues at an ever-increasing rate. We now call for immediate and decisive action by governments worldwide. We call for governments to halt greenhouse gas emissions. We call for governments to take action to prevent further biodiversity loss. And we call for governments to restore, to the fullest extent possible, the damage that has already been done. As scientists, we have an obligation beyond merely describing and understanding the natural world. We must now take an active part in helping to protect it. We note that we've tried already all conventional methods to draw attention to this crisis. And we believe that the continued government inaction against the climate and ecological crisis constitutes a crime against humanity. We believe that this crime now justifies non-violent direct action, which goes beyond the bounds of the law. This is why we are therefore actively supporting those who are rising up peacefully against governments that are failing to act proportionately to the scale of the crisis. We believe it's our moral duty to act now, and we urge you and other scientists to join us to protect humanity's only home. This declaration has now been signed by over 1,500 climate scientists, biological scientists, biodiversity scientists across the globe. Scientists in a range of different fields, over half of whom research directly into the climate and ecological crisis in fields that are directly related to the climate and ecological emergency. Heads of department, lecturers, heads of climate research institutes. I stand here today representing those scientists to tell you the truth, and to tell you the truth in a way that countless other speakers, researchers and journalists, such as the ones we're here to honour tonight, have tried to do. And as you've heard, several tragically have been prevented from doing so. So I'm here to represent the scientists who say we must now make sure that the media do tell the truth, that journalists tell the truth, that the government tell the truth and that they act on this truth. The truth is that the world is warming. The world is now 1.1 degrees hotter than it was during pre-industrial revolution times. This may not sound much, but in the scale of what that does to the planet, it is enormous. We now know unequivocally that this rise in temperature has been caused by greenhouse gas emissions, specifically, well, not entirely, but one of the main causes of that is carbon dioxide. And that is a result of burning fossil fuels, which increases pumping out carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which forms a sort of blanket around the Earth. It's required to be there to keep us warm, but increased levels of this make the blanket thicker, so we are getting hotter. We now know directly and unequivocally that these things are linked, that human action has caused carbon dioxide levels to increase to a level that they've never been seen before for 3 million years. We now know that that is a direct cause of the temperature rise that we are now seeing, and that global temperature has never risen this fast, because that's what's crucial here, this much or this fast in over 2,000 years. And the implications of this are absolutely catastrophic. Just to give you a few examples, because I'm sure you've all heard and read about them on the news, it is all true. Extreme weather conditions are getting more and more frequent because of global warming. You may hear people say, oh, but it's colder where I live. Oh, but sometimes it's colder, sometimes it's wetter, sometimes it snows more. Yes, those are a direct cause of global warming. Because it's not just about heat waves, which are happening faster, more extreme and more often than ever before, but it's also about extreme weather that is caused by this extra heat. This extra heat causes more evaporation from the oceans. It causes more water to be absorbed into the atmosphere, which falls as rain. It causes disruption to our climate and our weather systems, such as the Gulf Stream, which means that we not only get heat waves, but we also get more extreme cold, more extreme rainfall, more extreme snow. All of this is a direct impact of climate change and global warming. We can never say any one weather event has definitely been caused by humans. That is simply impossible to do. But if you look at the trends and you look at the increase in frequency of these events, it is unequivocal. The heat waves that took place over Europe in summer of 2018 were made up to 100 times more likely by climate change. That means they're going to happen 100 times more frequently. It is predicted that by the middle of the century, we could be getting such heat waves every other summer in the UK. The climate and the weather in Leeds could be more similar to the weather in Melbourne. Now that might seem nice, but when you think about what this does to crops, when you think about what it does to those who are vulnerable, like children and the elderly, what it does to farming land, this is huge impacts. And this is just here in the UK. And here in the UK, we actually rely on 50% of our food from countries across the world. 70 or 80% of our fruit and vegetables that are being imported. That are being imported by countries that are suffering more and more droughts, more and more heat waves, more and more floods, more and more monsoons as a direct result of climate change. It is predicted that it's going to become increasingly more likely that there will be multiple crop failures across multiple areas as we move towards the middle of the century. That means the chances of us being able to get the food that we need to eat in this country is going down. That risk of food prices going up, of running out of fresh water, of running out of enough food, is significantly increasing. We can never say exactly when this will happen, or exactly how likely it is to happen, but we can absolutely certainly say it is getting more likely, and we are moving towards tipping points that we simply do not know when they're going to be reached. There is a huge amount of global warming that is causing ice melting in lots of areas of the world. Some of those are causing instability in areas such as Antarctica, where there's a big ice sheet that is looking increasingly unstable, and scientists simply do not know at what point it's going to collapse. We are already, over the last 40 years, if you average it out, we are losing every second the amount of ice that is equivalent to 300 double-deckers bus worth of ice. Every second. If and when, as and when, the Antarctic ice chunk collapses, we could be committing ourselves to huge amounts of sea level rise. As it is, even without that, the latest predictions show that by the middle of the century, the floods across the UK and across the world that used to happen once a century will be happening every other year. By the middle of the century, there could be 300 million people across the globe whose homes are flooded once a year. That's going to lead to mass migration. That's going to lead to potentially civil unrest and even wars. That's going to lead to a lot of people not being able to get enough food to eat or water to drink. I say going to, of course we don't know. Nobody knows, but in science, what we know already is scary. What's even scarier is what we don't know. What we can predict, but actually often is already happening far faster than we've been able to predict, because climate models are simply not able to tell us exactly when these things will happen, and a lot of them are happening faster than have been predicted. Climate change not only changes the weather, it also damages our seas by making them more acidic because of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, damaging the very simple life forms that are required for the entire ecosystem of the seas to be able to survive. And speaking of ecosystems, climate change in combination with human action on land and soil degradation is causing huge impacts on our biodiversity. Climate change increases the likelihood that soils are going to be eroded, and we've now lost 50% of our topsoil across the world. Topsoil is required to grow crops, which are required to feed us. Also required to grow crops are insects, because they pollinate those crops. Because of the biodiversity crisis, we are losing huge numbers of our insects. You can think of biodiversity like a game of Jenga. We're all interlinked. Food webs, food chains are all interlinked. Take out one little piece at the bottom and everything's going to crumble. We've lost 50% of our wildlife since the 1970s. There's a 60% decline in populations of many animals that have been studied. Over the next 10 years, we're expected to lose to extinction around 1 million species. Scientists are saying that we are entering the 6th mass extinction. That's not just because of how many species we're losing, but how fast we're losing them. And we simply will not be able to adapt. It's not just that biodiversity is beautiful, it's not just that we like to look at the wonders of nature, but it's that we depend on nature for our very survival. Because of what we eat, but also for shelter, and also to help us to simply survive on this planet. We are linked, and if we damage the biodiversity, we are damaging ourselves ultimately. This is just a small, tiny part of all of the horrors that are going on in the world. And believe me, I could stand here for a lot longer and talk a lot more, but I'm sure we're getting cold. So, I just want to finish by telling you that, yes, it is that bad, yes, it is that scary, and yes, we do need to do something fast. And no, we're not doing enough. You might hear that, yes, Parliament has declared a climate and ecological emergency. What did they do? Very, very little. When the internal review went into Parliament, into the government in July, and looked at the measures put in place to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, out of the 24 goals that were put in place, only 7 were even being looked at, or even had any chance of being met. We are failing to meet all our targets. We are failing to meet biodiversity targets. In 2016, it was reported that UK was one of the worst in terms of biodiversity loss, that 1 in 5 British mammals was now at risk of extinction. 3 years later, in 2019, the same report says it's now 1 in 4. It's getting worse, and it's getting worse that quickly. According to latest studies in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, we have about 8 years until we run out of the carbon budget required to keep us below 1.5 degrees warming. If we go above 1.5 degrees warming, a According to the Paris Agreement, according to the IPCC, according to everything that I've just given you information about, the impacts are going to be catastrophic. We're currently heading much higher than that. We're heading towards, potentially by the end of the century, up to 4 degrees of warming, according to some studies, which is a situation that could lead us to 1 to 2 meters of sea level rise, a situation which some scientists have said leads to a world which they cannot see could home more than 1 billion people. We're already heading towards 8 billion people in terms of our population. So we have to bring global greenhouse gas emissions down now. And we have to first and foremost start here in the UK. Because it's not just in the UK, it's not just about what we release on our home territory. You know, many people say, oh, but the UK's doing well, we're bringing our emissions down, we don't actually release that much. Firstly, we release twice as much as we ought to per head, in terms of the global population, on our just terrestrial emissions. Secondly, those figures, which are actually, for the record, about 1.5% of global carbon released by UK terrestrial emissions. Secondly, those figures do not include aviation or shipping, which are the 2 biggest emitters, pretty much. But most importantly is that does not include embedded emissions. Emissions in the stuff that we import, that we eat, that we drink, that we use, that we consume, that we wear, fast fashion, etc. Stuff that's flown in pumping out huge amounts of carbon when it was first produced and huge amounts of carbon when it's imported to this country. Those figures also do not include investments from the City of London, near here, in fossil fuels. About 15% of global investments in fossil fuels come from banks that have their national or international headquarters here in the City of London. And it also does not include fossil fuel subsidies. Over the last 5 years, the UK government has invested £2.5 billion in fossil fuel subsidies across the world, particularly in low and middle income countries. That's greater than any other country in the EU. So anyone who says, oh, but we're trying, oh, but we're working in it, oh, but we're doing enough, it's not true. So we need the government to listen. We need no more people like these tragic deaths here to be having to try to raise awareness, to try and speak truth and being silenced. Because, okay, we might not be being killed. Maybe some people are. But we're certainly being silenced because it's not being reported on enough as it should be, and it's certainly not being acted on with anything close to the appropriate measures according to the scale and the intensity of this crisis. A recent report endorsed by 11,000 scientists published in Australia said that this is a clear and unequivocal crisis caused by humans, and it will lead to incalculable suffering unless we act now. But I just want to leave you with hope that if we do act now, and we can act now, and we can act radically, that we can do something about this, that it's not too late. Yes, there will probably still be suffering, but if we act now and we act quickly, we can look towards a brighter future where we can have a beautiful world, where we can work together, where we can have communities who are growing things together, who are working together to think of new, innovative solutions to look at this. And I would urge those who haven't to watch a beautiful new documentary that's just been released called 2040, which looks at some possible global solutions to the climate crisis and the ecological crisis, and looks at how beautiful and inspiring the world could be in 2040 if we act now and if we act together to do things to be able to create a better future for our children and our grandchildren. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Is the question, can I come to the pub?